On the morning of January 24th, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was escorted from his cell at Florida State Prison to the execution chamber, where a wooden electric chair waited for him. He had refused his last meal. He had spent the previous day giving interviews, confessing, finally, to murders he had denied for 15 years, naming locations of bodies that families had been searching for since the mid-1970s. He was 42 years old. Here is something most people don't know about Ted Bundy. While he was killing women across the Pacific Northwest, he was also staffing a crisis hotline in Seattle, answering calls from people on the edge of suicide, talking them back from it, being rated by his supervisors as effective. People called back to say he had helped them. The same man, the same warmth, the same voice. Outside the prison, several hundred people had gathered to wait for the announcement of his death. Some held signs. Some cheered when the news came. A small number protested the execution on principle, opposed to the death penalty regardless of the condemned. The rest had come because this was the end of something that had occupied the country for over a decade. The end of Ted Bundy, who had killed at least 30 women in 7 states, who had escaped from custody twice, who had represented himself at his own murder trial and proposed marriage to a witness in the middle of it, who had been, for reasons that still resist clean explanation, the most famous serial killer in American history and a celebrity to an extent that no killer before or since has quite replicated. He was seated in the chair. The witnesses took their positions. He said 12 words: "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The switch was thrown. He was pronounced dead at 7:15 in the morning. Outside the prison, the people who had been waiting cheered. What follows is the story of how Theodore Robert Bundy became Ted Bundy. The man, the crimes, the escapes, the celebrity, the trial, the confession, and the specific quality of the cultural fascination that has never quite gone away since the morning in 1989, when the electric chair in Starker, Florida, finally resolved the question of what would happen to him. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, a facility that existed for precisely the situation his mother found herself in. His mother's name was Eleanor Louise Cowell, known as Louise. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and living with her parents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a household organized around Methodist faith and the social conventions of mid-1940s American family life. The conventions were specific. An unmarried pregnancy in that household, in that era, was a catastrophe. It was evidence of moral failure. It was something that had to be managed, concealed if possible, explained away if not. Louise went to Burlington to give birth at the Lund home, which had been established for exactly this purpose. She spent several weeks there. Then she came back to Philadelphia, not alone, but with the baby. She brought the infant back into the family house, but she did not bring him back as her son. She brought him back as her brother. The arrangement that was constructed around Theodore's existence was a complete rewriting of the facts. His grandparents, Sam and Eleanor Cowell, were presented to the outside world, and to Theodore himself, as he grew old enough to understand the shape of his family, as his parents. Louise was presented as his sister. The pregnancy had not happened officially. The Lund home had not been necessary, officially. Theodore Cowell was simply a child in the Cowell family, youngest of the siblings. He grew up believing this. There was, in the household, presumably an understanding that this was the story, and the story was not to be disturbed. Children in these arrangements often know at some level that the official story does not completely hold, that the textures of relationships don't quite match what they're told, that the woman they're told is their sister responds to them in ways that feel different from the ways sisters respond. Whether Theodore knew or sensed or suspected the truth before he was told it is unknowable. What is known is that at some point, in his late teens or early 20s, when he obtained his birth certificate and found his mother listed as Louise Cowell and no father listed at all, he learned officially that everything he had been told about the most fundamental facts of his origin was false. This discovery is handled differently in different accounts of his life. Some give it enormous weight, treating it as a foundational trauma that explains much of what followed. Others treat it as one element among many, significant but not singularly determinative. What is clear is that the discovery was made in the context of a personality that was already developing in directions that concerned people who knew him, and that the confirmation of the family's deception, the revelation that the people he had grown up trusting had arranged a comprehensive lie around his existence, did not improve whatever was already developing in him. His grandfather, Sam Cowell, was the dominant male figure in the household during Theodore's early years. The accounts of Sam Cowell are contested. Some describe him as a violent man who beat family members and neighbors and expressed his rage through his body with regularity. A man around whom the household organized itself according to his moods, in the way that households around violent men always organize themselves. Other accounts describe him as merely strict, the product of an era and a faith that understood strictness as a form of love. What is documented is that Theodore witnessed violence in the household from an early age, that the household was not warm in any of the conventional senses, and that his earliest experiences of the adult male world around him were organized around power and the expressions of power. His Aunt Julia woke one morning, in those early years in Philadelphia, to find young Ted, he would have been perhaps 3 years old, standing over her while she slept, with knives arranged around her body, smiling. She described this incident decades later, and the description has the quality of something that was remembered because it was impossible to forget, a moment that made no sense at the time and then eventually made too much sense. He liked knives. He had liked them from as early as anyone could remember, with an interest that went beyond the ordinary childhood fascination and into something more focused, more sustained, more clearly about what the objects could do. When Louise moved to Tacoma, Washington, with 4-year-old Theodore, joining an uncle's household, then remarrying a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy, the name changed. Theodore Cowell became Ted Bundy, taking his stepfather's name. The relationship with the stepfather never followed. Johnny Bundy was by all accounts a decent man who tried hard. Camping trips, activities, the practical gestures of paternal effort, and who received in return politeness that was essentially empty. Ted was cooperative. He helped with his younger siblings. He did not bond with Johnny, and he was not going to bond with Johnny. And Johnny's efforts, however sincere, were not equal to the task of displacing whatever had been established in the Philadelphia household, or in whatever Ted had already become by the time they arrived in Tacoma. He was, in Tacoma, a student of the Pacific Northwest suburban variety. Adequate academically, not exceptional. Better at the performance of achievement than at the deeper quality of intellectual engagement that would have distinguished real ability. He had a social facility in small groups that could read as charm, but that his closer contemporaries remembered as something slightly off. The ability to produce the right responses without quite generating the warmth that the responses were supposed to convey. He stole throughout adolescence, shoplifting, taking what he found, operating with a casual assumption that other people's belongings were available to him when he wanted them. He described this in later interviews with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had never quite understood why the behavior was supposed to be unusual. The rules that governed what belonged to whom had never had the authority for him that they apparently had for everyone else. He skied. He was handsome in the specific way of the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1960s. He went to the University of Washington and studied, eventually, psychology. After a period at the University of Puget Sound, and a year abroad in Beijing studying Chinese, and a period of drift after dropping out in 1968 that took him briefly to Philadelphia and the birth certificate and the official confirmation of what his origin actually was. He came back to Seattle. He re-enrolled. He worked on the campaign of the Republican gubernatorial candidate Daniel Evans. He was accepted to law school at the University of Utah. Before any of that, there was Stephanie Brooks. She had broken up with him in 1968, polished from a wealthy California family, the kind of woman who represented everything he aspired to be adjacent to. The rejection did not resolve itself in him the way most rejections eventually do. It organized into something else. He improved himself deliberately, got into law school, became more socially confident, worked on his presentation, and then recontacted her in 1973. They dated again. She found him improved. Then he stopped returning her calls without explanation. She wrote to him. He did not respond. Eventually she stopped trying. He had reversed the script. The woman who had rejected him experienced the rejection on his terms, at his timing, when he had decided it was done. What the timeline shows, the reconnection with Stephanie Brooks, the deliberate ending of it, and the first murder, is that all three happened within approximately the same year. Whether they are causally connected is a question that researchers have debated for decades and the psychological literature has not resolved. What is not in question is what came next. He was, by all visible indications, a young man going places. Part of that going places was a volunteer job on a crisis hotline, a phone line for people in distress, staffed by ordinary people who took calls at 2 in the morning when other options had run out. One of the other volunteers was a woman named Anne Rule. She was 34, a former Seattle police officer who had spent the subsequent decade writing for true crime magazines and working toward a book. She was good at understanding criminals. It was her profession to be. She was also, by every account, warm and genuinely perceptive, and the kind of person who paid real attention. She and Ted worked the same overnight shifts. She liked him from the first night, found him warm, funny, in the self-deprecating way she responded to, attentive in the way of someone who actually remembered what you had said. They became friends. She thought of him as the kind of young man she would have wanted as a son. He was, during those shifts, answering calls from people considering suicide. He was patient with them. He listened. His supervisors rated him as effective, which is to say, people called back to say he had helped. Whatever warmth he presented on those calls, it worked. The people on the other end of the phone responded to it as real. Anne Rule would spend 15 years trying to understand how she had missed it. Her book, The Stranger Beside Me, published in 1980, became one of the most significant true crime works ever written. Not for its crime reporting, but for its central question, which Rule herself never fully resolved. How does a trained, experienced, perceptive person sit beside someone like this and feel nothing but warmth? The answer she arrived at was that she had not missed it because she was inattentive. She had missed it because Bundy was genuinely good at the presentation, not performing warmth as a disguise, but deploying it as a tool with the facility of someone who had practiced the behavior until it was functionally indistinguishable from the genuine article. While he was answering those calls, he was also planning the first murder. There were incidents he described later in the third-person interviews with journalist Stephen Michaud, with the careful distance of someone discussing a stranger. The late-night drives through neighborhoods, the looking, the way the edge of his consciousness could expand or contract depending on what was outside a window in the dark. What is not in question is what happened next. The murders began, by the confirmed record, In January of 1974, they began not with a stranger encountered in a public place, not with the sling-on-the-arm performance that he would later refine, but with a break-in. He entered the basement apartment of an 18-year-old University of Washington student named Karen Sparks while she was asleep, struck her repeatedly with a metal rod he found in her room, and sexually assaulted her. She survived. She had permanent neurological damage. She had not seen his face. The method of entry, breaking in through a window while the victim slept, was not the method he is most associated with in the cultural memory of his crimes. The cultural memory holds the sling and the VW Beetle and the request for help with the sailboat. What the first attack establishes is that the sling and the sailboat were a later development, a refinement, a technique that evolved. In January of 1974, he was breaking into apartments in the dark. By July of the same year, he was approaching women in crowded parks in broad daylight. The evolution is worth noting because it suggests someone who was learning, who was treating the operational side of what he was doing as a problem to be solved, and who was iterating toward better solutions. The bright daylight, the crowded park, the 40,000 people who were present and who saw nothing and remembered only a charming young man with his arm in a sling. The following month after Karen Sparks, he broke into the apartment of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, also a University of Washington student. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in clean clothes from her closet, wrapped her in the sheets from her bed, and took her with him. He made the bed before he left. Her roommates found everything in order the following morning, except that Linda was not there. Her body was found 14 months later on Taylor Mountain in the Cascade Range, along with the remains of 4 other women. Taylor Mountain. The investigators who found it understood immediately what they were looking at. Not a disposal site, but something more deliberate, a specific place that he had used repeatedly, a place that he had chosen and returned to. The psychology of that choice, the repeated return, the specific location, is something that the researchers who worked his case spent years unpacking. By June of 1974, 6 women had disappeared from the Seattle-Tacoma area and 1 from Corvallis, Oregon. All young, all attractive, all with brown hair parted in the middle, all connected to university environments, all gone without any physical evidence of where they had gone or who had taken them. Investigators had a pattern and no suspect. And Ted Bundy was working for the Republican Party and applying to law school and volunteering on a governor's campaign, visible in all the right places, presenting exactly the right surface to everyone who looked at him. 4 people had already reported his name to law enforcement. Elizabeth Klopfer, his girlfriend, had called the King County Police and told them about the composite sketch, about the tan Volkswagen Beetle, about the day he said he had other things to do. A DES coworker had filed a separate report. A University of Washington psychology professor had submitted his name through a separate channel. Anne Rule had contacted investigators about the man she had worked beside on the crisis hotline. 4 separate people, the same name, the same car. Investigators received 200 tips per day and filed the reports and moved on because the man described did not match the person they were constructing in their imaginations. He was too clean, too visible, too evidently normal. The murders continued. Bundy committed what may have been his most audacious act, and the one that best illustrates the specific nature of his operating method. Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington was full that Sunday. It was a hot day. Temperatures in the 80s, the kind of Pacific Northwest summer day that draws 40,000 people to a park. Families, couples, sunbathers, groups of friends on blankets by the water. A man approached Janice Ann Ott, 23 years old, as she sat on a blanket alone near the beach. He introduced himself as Ted. He was wearing a sling on his left arm and explained that he had injured himself playing tennis. He chatted with her, found her amenable, and asked if she might help him unload a sailboat from his car in the parking lot. His parents lived just up the hill. It would only take a few minutes. Janice Ott had arrived that morning on her yellow bicycle. She had left a note for her roommate on the door of their apartment, with a drawing of a sun, saying she was going sunbathing. Her husband was in California attending medical school. She left with the man who called himself Ted. 3 witnesses saw them leave together. 3.5 hours later, the same man with the same story, the same sling, the same sailboat, the same parents just up the hill, approached Denise Marie Nasland, 19 years old, near the bathrooms. She had been at the park with her boyfriend and 2 other friends. She had stepped away to use the restroom. Denise Nasland left with him too. Neither woman was ever seen alive again. The witnesses who had seen one or both of the women with the man with the sling gave their accounts to investigators. A sketch was produced and circulated. A name was released. The man had given his name as Ted. He drove a tan Volkswagen Beetle. 4 separate people contacted the police with the same name. The first was Elizabeth Klopfer, Liz as she was known, Bundy's girlfriend of several years. She had seen the sketch in the newspaper. She had seen the description of the tan Volkswagen. She had been told by Ted himself that he had had other things to do that Sunday afternoon and couldn't see her. She called the King County Police and gave them Ted Bundy's name. A DES office employee who had worked with Bundy filed a report with his name. A University of Washington professor who had known Bundy filed a report with his name. Anne Rule, reading the description and the composite sketch, recognized the man she had worked alongside on the crisis hotline and contacted investigators. 4 people. The same name. A description that matched. A car that matched. A pattern of disappearances from university environments that matched his daily movements exactly. Investigators looked at the name. They looked at Ted Bundy's record. Clean. They looked at his profile. Law student, Republican Party worker, volunteer for a governor's campaign. They received 200 tips a day on the Lake Sammamish disappearances. They filed the reports. The murders continued. And then he did something that should have been impossible. He moved to another state and started again. While investigators in Washington state were attempting to connect the disappearances of at least 7 women to an unidentified subject, while families were waiting for answers, while the police composite was circulating, while Elizabeth Klopfer and Anne Rule and 2 other people were filing reports with Ted Bundy's name, the person responsible was in the process of packing his apartment, loading his Volkswagen Beetle, and driving to Salt Lake City. He was relocating to a new university environment, in a new state, where nobody knew his name or his face. He was starting over. He enrolled in law school. He found an apartment. He continued. The killings in Utah began within weeks. Nancy Wilcox, 16 years old, disappeared in October 1974 from the Salt Lake City suburb of Holiday. Melissa Smith, 17, daughter of a local police chief, disappeared the same month and was found murdered in the mountains. Laura Aim, 17, disappeared on Halloween night from a convenience store and was found strangled near a river a month later. These 3 disappeared and died within 31 days of each other, in a metropolitan area where a law student from Seattle was new to town and unknown. Then came Carol Dauronch. She was 18 years old on November 8, 1974, browsing a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, when a man approached her and introduced himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her that someone had attempted to break into her car in the parking lot and asked if she would come with him to file a report. He was convincing, poised, specific, the right combination of authority and reassurance. He led her to a car outside the mall that was, he said, his patrol vehicle. It was a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Once inside, he produced handcuffs and attempted to restrain her. She fought. He struck her with a crowbar. She got the door open, a Volkswagen Beetle door, which she managed to force despite his weight against it, and she stumbled into the road and flagged down a passing car. She was alive. She had seen his face. She would recognize him. Later that same evening, 17-year-old Deborah Kent left a high school production of The Redhead in Bountiful, Utah, to pick up her younger brother from a skating rink nearby. She was never seen again. Investigators found a small key on the asphalt of the school parking lot. The key fit the handcuffs that had been on Carol Daronch's wrists. He was also active in Colorado during this period, driving the 3 hours from Salt Lake City to the ski resorts of the Rockies, where young women from universities around the country came for winter recreation. Karen Campbell, 23, a nurse from Michigan, disappeared from a hallway at a ski resort in Snowmass on February 17, 1975, after stepping away from her companions to retrieve a magazine from her hotel room. She was found dead in a snowbank off a dirt road 6 weeks later. Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared in March 1975 from a parking lot in Vail. Denise Oliverson, 24, disappeared in April from Grand Junction. He was moving between 2 states, attending law school, killing women, and returning to his apartment and his coursework with a regularity that produced no visible stress in either direction. The multi-state conference happened in November of 1975 in Aspen, Colorado. Investigators from Washington, Utah, Oregon, and Colorado gathered to compare their cases. By the end of the conference, the consensus was clear. They were looking at the same person. The physical description was consistent. The victim profile, young, attractive, brown-haired, connected to university environments, was consistent. The methods were consistent. The mobility across state lines was consistent. They still did not have a name. In August of 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward pulled over a tan Volkswagen Beetle in Granger, Utah, after it ran from him when he illuminated his lights. The driver identified himself as Ted Bundy, a University of Utah law student. The officer noted that the interior of the car seemed unusual. He called for backup. Officers searched the car. In the back seat and the trunk, they found items that did not belong in a law student's car. A crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, an ice pick, rope, wire, a flashlight, and rubber gloves. Things for which no innocent explanation was readily available, assembled in a quantity and a combination that had a specific purpose. Carol Daronch was brought to a lineup. She identified Ted Bundy without hesitation as the man who had called himself Officer Roseland and tried to handcuff her in a Volkswagen Beetle in November. He was convicted of aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years. He began serving the sentence. He began planning his escape. The first escape happened on June 7, 1977, at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, where Bundy had been transferred to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. He had been representing himself at the preliminary hearings, a decision that gave him access to the courthouse law library, that allowed him to be in the building without physical restraint, that placed him periodically in a second-floor room with windows that opened outward and a drop to the ground that a healthy man could survive. The judge had determined that because he was acting as his own defense attorney, he did not need to wear handcuffs or leg shackles inside the courthouse. He was accompanied by a bailiff but not restrained. On June 7th, during a recess from a preliminary hearing, Bundy was left briefly unattended in the library. He opened a second-floor window. He assessed the drop, approximately 30 feet to the ground below, and jumped. He rolled when he landed. He had sprained his ankle. He ran. He ran into the mountains above Aspen, the Elk Range, the dense forest above the town, terrain that was rugged and cold even in June, and that offered concealment at the cost of difficulty. He had no money, no supplies, no equipment. He had a sprained ankle. He had a 6-day head start before he was caught, near exhaustion, driving a stolen car erratically through Aspen at 2 in the morning on June 13th, and identified by the officers who stopped him. Everyone assumed the lessons had been learned. He was transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, a facility described as more secure. The security was tightened. The oversight was increased. What no one had done was change the architecture of his cell. Bundy examined the cell with the methodical attention he brought to everything. He identified a weak point, a square opening above the light fixture in the ceiling, which connected to a crawl space between floors. The opening was small. He was not small. But the opening was a fixed dimension, and his body was not. Over the following months, he lost 35 pounds. Deliberately, systematically, through reduced eating and exercise, he remade his body to fit the hole. He had time. He had motivation. He had the specific patience of a man who has decided what needs to happen and is preparing for it without hurry. He also obtained a hacksaw blade from fellow inmates. He used it to cut through the steel reinforcing around the ceiling opening, working slowly at night, concealing the work during the day. He accumulated $500, smuggled in through correspondence with supporters on the outside. He studied the layout of the jail above his cell, the crawl space, the ductwork, the structure of the building, and identified that the space above him connected to the personal apartment of the chief jailer, who would be away on holiday for Christmas. On the night of December 30th, 1977, with the jail operating on a skeleton holiday staff, Bundy made his bed. He piled books and clothing under his blanket in the approximate shape and weight of a sleeping person, arranged the sheets, and left what he intended to look like himself asleep in the bunk. Then he climbed through the ceiling opening and into the crawl space. He navigated the ductwork for some distance. He dropped down through a hatch into the jailer's personal apartment. He found the jailer's civilian clothes. He changed out of his prison uniform. He walked out through the front entrance of the jail. The night staff did not notice his absence until shortly before noon the following day, nearly 17 hours later, by which time Ted Bundy had hitchhiked from Glenwood Springs to Vail, caught a bus to Denver, and boarded a flight to Chicago. From Chicago, he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. From Ann Arbor, he drove a stolen car to Atlanta. From Atlanta, he boarded a Greyhound bus to Tallahassee, Florida. He arrived in Tallahassee on January 8, 1978. He rented a room at a rooming house near the Florida State University campus, signing the lease under the name Chris Hagen. He was free. He was unknown. He was in a college town. He had been free for 8 days when the killing started again. Tallahassee in January of 1978 was exactly the kind of environment that Ted Bundy had operated in for 4 years. A college town organized around Florida State University, with a large population of young women living in dormitories and sorority houses and shared apartments within walking distance of the campus. He moved into the Oaks rooming house under the name Chris Hagen. He had no money of any significance. He shoplifted food from supermarkets. He stole a bicycle from the campus. He went to bars and watched football games and presented himself as a recent graduate looking for work in the area, which was true enough to be functional as a social identity. He had been free for 2 weeks. On the night of January 14th, he walked to the Chi Omega sorority house on West Jefferson Street, approximately a mile from his room. He entered through a rear door that had a faulty lock, a lock that had been reported as broken and not yet repaired. It was past 3 in the morning. 32 women lived in the house. All of them were asleep. He was inside for approximately 15 minutes. In those 15 minutes, moving through the darkened house with a section of oak firewood he had picked up outside, he attacked 4 women in 4 rooms. Margaret Bowman, 21 years old, a junior from St. Petersburg, was found bludgeoned and strangled with her own nylon stocking. She did not wake during the attack. She had been asleep when he entered her room and was dead before she knew anyone was there. Lisa Levy, 20 years old, a junior from St. Petersburg, was beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and bitten deeply on her left buttock and her right breast. The bite marks, impressions left in human tissue with the specific contours of a specific person's teeth, became the most important forensic evidence in the trial. Bite mark analysis was not new to forensic science in 1978, but it had never been used in quite this way in a major case, and the odontological expert who testified about the marks on Lisa Levy's body would become one of the central witnesses in the prosecution. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner survived. Both were found with severe head injuries, shattered jaws, broken teeth, lacerations. Chandler told investigators that she had heard a banging sound and then nothing else until she was lying on the floor with blood on her face. Nearly every bone in her face was broken. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. A woman returning to the house in the early morning hours had seen headlights on outside, and that light, visible through the window of the room where one of the attacks was occurring, had apparently startled Bundy into leaving. If she had arrived 30 seconds later, or if the headlights had not fallen at that specific angle, the outcome of the night might have been different. He left the sorority house and walked 8 blocks to the apartment of a woman named Cheryl Thomas, an FSU dance student who lived alone. He entered her apartment and attacked her. Her neighbors in the adjacent unit heard the sounds through the wall, the impact, then a strange moaning, and called Cheryl's phone. When she didn't answer, they called the police. Bundy was gone before the officers arrived. Cheryl Thomas survived with severe head injuries and permanent hearing loss in one ear. He was in his room at the Oaks by the time the investigation was underway at Chi Omega. He went to sleep. He woke up the next morning and went to a campus bar to watch the football coverage and hear what people were saying. 25 days later, on February 9, 1978, he abducted Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. She was 12 years old. She was the youngest of his confirmed victims. Her remains were found 6 weeks later in an abandoned pig shed in Suwannee County. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. He was arrested on February 15, 1978, by a Pensacola police officer who ran a routine check on a stolen Volkswagen and found its driver to be Ted Bundy, wanted in multiple states. He was placed in custody. He would not escape again. What followed was one of the most publicly visible criminal proceedings in American history, and Bundy managed it as a performance from the moment it began. He represented himself. This was not a decision made from genuine legal strategy. His legal training was incomplete and his actual courtroom effectiveness was limited, but from the desire to be at the center of the proceedings, to be the person making arguments and calling witnesses and controlling, as much as possible, what the cameras captured. The cameras were there because the trial was televised, a consequence of the public fascination with Bundy that had been building since his name had become nationally known. Women wrote to him throughout the proceedings. The letters arrived by the stack at the county jail. Women who had seen him on television and who found him attractive, who believed he was innocent, who wanted a relationship with him. This phenomenon, the specific romantic fixation that a subset of the public developed for a man on trial for the brutal murder of young women, became its own subject of study in the years that followed. The researchers who analyzed it found it consistent with a broader pattern, the equation of physical attractiveness and apparent intelligence with innocence, and the specific kind of misplaced sympathy that high-profile trials sometimes generate in people who follow them primarily through the media. He was charming in the courtroom. There was no avoiding this fact. He was funny in the specific dry way that reads well on camera. He was articulate in cross-examination and quick with the kind of comeback that makes courtrooms laugh. The jury watched him, and saw the same thing that everyone who had ever encountered Ted Bundy saw. A man who presented as warm, intelligent, and improbably reasonable for someone accused of what he was accused of. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders on July 24, 1979. Judge Edward Cowart, who presided over the trial and who became, in the coverage of the proceedings, a figure of particular moral authority for the manner in which he combined professional rigor with a kind of reluctant acknowledgement of Bundy's personal qualities, delivered the death sentence with words that entered the case's mythology. "You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself." 2 death sentences. A third followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach in 1980, during the same trial in which Bundy proposed to Carol Ann Boone on the witness stand, exploiting an obscure Florida law that made a courtroom declaration of marriage legally binding. Carol Ann Boone accepted from the witness stand. They were married on camera in the middle of a murder trial, with a notary public she had arranged in advance standing by. 2 years later, while Bundy was on death row, Carol Boone gave birth to their daughter, Rose. Conjugal visits were prohibited at Florida State Prison. Investigators and Ann Rule concluded independently that the most likely explanation was bribed prison staff, a mechanism consistent with the lifelong pattern of a man who identified what systems were trying to prevent and found the specific point at which they could be circumvented. Carol Boone divorced him in 1986, after he finally confessed privately to her that the accusations were true. She moved back to Washington State with 6-year-old Rose. They changed their names. When Bundy was executed on January 24, 1989, Rose did not come to say goodbye. She was 6 years old. Her mother had decided not to put her in that room. Carol Boone died in 2018. Rose Bundy's whereabouts are not publicly known. She has given no interviews and made no public statements. The only confirmed thing about her is that she is alive, somewhere in America, leading a private life under a name that is not the one she was born with. The daughter of a man whose face is still on documentary thumbnails and podcast covers 40 years after his crimes and 35 years after his execution. She has chosen, apparently, not to be part of any of that. It may be the most reasonable decision anyone connected to this case has ever made. Ted Bundy spent 9 years on death row at Florida State Prison, filing appeals and granting interviews and becoming, in ways that no one had anticipated and many found disturbing, a cultural phenomenon. The appeals produced nothing. Each one was reviewed, argued, and denied. The case against him was overwhelming and well documented, and the procedural challenges he mounted were not sufficient to overcome it. He remained on death row and continued the only project available to him there, which was the management of his own public image and the prolongation of his existence. The interviews he gave were extensive and, in their way, revealing. He spoke with criminologists and forensic psychologists who found him a genuinely unusual subject. A person who demonstrated psychopathic traits in a configuration and degree that was clinically remarkable, who was also unusually articulate about his own psychology, unusually willing to engage with the analysis. He spoke with journalists who found him charming, and then felt disturbed about having found him charming. He spoke with a religious broadcaster named James Dobson, who sought him out in the final days before his execution for a conversation about pornography and its effects on behavior. A conversation in which Bundy offered an account of how pornography had influenced his development, that many researchers found strategically constructed and self-serving, and some found partially credible. In the final days, working with investigators, he gave the confessions that mattered. He provided specific information about cases that had been unresolved since the 1970s. He drew maps. He named locations. He gave details about crimes that only the person who committed them could have known. In some cases, the information led to recoveries of remains that families had been waiting for 15 years. In some cases, it led nowhere, because the locations had changed or the evidence had dispersed. He confessed to 30 murders. He implied the number was higher. The investigators who worked with him in those final hours believed the true number was substantially higher than 30. On the morning of January 24, 1989, he said 12 words, and then the switch was thrown. There were 3 people who survived direct attacks by Ted Bundy and who gave accounts of what that survival felt like. Karen Sparks, 18 years old in January of 1974, was beaten in her basement apartment while she slept and survived with permanent neurological damage. She did not see her attacker. She woke in the hospital not knowing what had happened to her. She spent years rebuilding what the attack had taken from her. She has, over the years, given limited interviews about the experience, always with the careful, measured quality of someone for whom the subject carries a specific and permanent weight. Carol Durant was 18 when Bundy approached her in the mall in Murray, Utah, and she fought her way out of the car and escaped into traffic with handcuffs on her wrists. She was the witness who identified him in the lineup, the testimony that produced his first conviction, the person whose courage in that parking lot and in that courtroom was the first thing that actually stopped him. She has described the moment of the escape, the car door opening, the decision to run, as a moment when she simply stopped thinking and moved. She is alive because she moved. Kathy Kleiner was 20 years old at Chi Omega and survived the attack with severe injuries, including a shattered jaw, broken teeth, and multiple head wounds. She has given interviews in subsequent years in which she has been remarkably direct about the long aftermath of what happened to her, the physical recovery, the psychological work, the specific quality of a life lived after an event that could easily have ended it. She has said that she does not feel defined by being a Bundy survivor, that she has a full life, that she has refused to allow the worst night of her life to become the only thing about her. These 3 women, and the others who survived in different ways, the people who reported his name to the police, the investigators who built the cases that eventually caught and convicted him, are the people who are easiest to lose in the cultural processing of Ted Bundy, which tends to focus on the man at the center of the story rather than the people on its periphery. They are not peripheral, they are the whole point. The appeal of Bundy to the public, the specific, uncomfortable interest that millions of people took in him, was always more complicated than simple attraction to celebrity. It was partly the charm, which was real and documented, and which produced in people who encountered it firsthand a specific dissonance between what they knew intellectually and what they felt instinctively. He was warm. He was funny. He was attentive in conversation. These things were true even after everything else was also known. It was partly the question he embodied. How does someone who looks like this, who went to law school, who worked on political campaigns and crisis hotlines, who seems by all surface indications to be exactly what he presented himself as, how does someone like that turn out to be what he was? The answer that researchers and clinicians and forensic psychologists produced over decades of studying his case centered on the concept of psychopathy, the specific configuration of traits that include superficial charm, the absence of genuine empathy, a grandiose sense of entitlement, and the ability to present an entirely convincing social face while operating without any of the internal constraints that social faces are normally meant to represent. Bundy was not performing warmth badly, he was performing it well. The performance was good enough to fool people who should have known better, who did know better in one part of their mind, but who could not make that knowledge override what his presence produced in them. Anne Rule knew. The boyfriend who saw him at the apartment shortly after the attack on Karen Sparks, Bundy himself had briefly been at the scene, present in the chaos, thought he had looked disheveled and strange. and mentioned it to Rule. Liz Klupfer knew or sensed or reported his name to the police 4 separate times. Multiple people who worked with him at the Department of Emergency Services filed reports. They knew, and the knowledge was not enough, because the knowledge competed with the presence, with the warmth and the humor and the attentiveness that were also real, also present, also true about the same person. In the final days before his execution, Bundy gave a series of interviews to criminologists and journalists and the religious broadcaster James Dobson, who had sought him out as a subject for a conversation about the effects of pornography on violence. Bundy accommodated this framing in ways that served his interest in delaying the execution, and that many researchers later found self-serving and strategically constructed. What was not self-serving in the final hours was the list. Working with investigators from Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, Bundy spent his final days providing information about murders he had not confessed to and about the location of remains that families had been unable to find. He named names. He drew maps. He provided specific details about crimes that had remained unsolved for 15 years. In some cases, the information led to recoveries. In some cases, it did not. He confessed to 30 murders. Investigators believe the true number was higher. Some researchers have estimated the number of victims at over 100, though the confirmed count remains significantly lower than that, and the higher estimates are contested. On the morning of January 24, 1989, he was led to the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida, 42 years old, and by the account of prison staff who interacted with him in his final hours, calm, in the way he had always been calm, composed, controlled, present. He said 12 words. The switch was thrown. Outside the prison, several hundred people who had gathered to witness the occasion cheered when the announcement came. Somewhere in Washington state, a 6-year-old girl named Rose did not say goodbye. Ted Bundy's legacy is not comfortable to summarize, because the legacy includes 2 things that sit in permanent tension with each other. The first is the victims. 30 confirmed women, and probably more. Young women who were students and daughters and friends and people with specific lives and specific futures, who encountered a man who had learned to use charm as a weapon and who paid for that encounter with everything they had. The specific horror of what he did to them, the violence, the control, the return to the sites afterward, is documented in the case files and in the confessions. It is not abstract. It is specific and documented and real. The second is the fascination. The letters, the Netflix documentaries, the films, the books, the academic literature on psychopathy that uses his case as a primary reference. The ongoing quality of public interest that has never diminished in 35 years since his execution, that was, if anything, intensified by the 2019 Netflix documentary and the Zac Efron film, and that produces with uncomfortable regularity a specific aesthetic response to his image and his story that is difficult to name without naming something unflattering about the culture that produces it. He was charming, and he was handsome, and he was intelligent, and he was a killer. And the American culture of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has never quite figured out what to do with a package that contains all of those things simultaneously. Anne Rule figured it out. She spent a career writing about it, carefully, with specificity and integrity. The book she wrote about the man she had worked beside on a crisis hotline, the man who had handed her coffee and made her laugh during the overnight shifts, the man whose victims she later tried to help find answers for, remains one of the most honest documents about what proximity to evil actually feels like when you are inside it and don't know yet what you are inside. She died in 2015. She never stopped writing about it. The question she kept asking, not about Bundy specifically, but about the broader question his existence posed, was one that the case has never resolved and perhaps cannot resolve. How do you recognize someone like this before it is too late? She knew him. She sat beside him. She liked him. She missed it. And that, perhaps more than anything else about the Bundy case, is the thing that stays with you. Not the number, not the escapes, not the trial spectacle, or the charm, or the fan letters, or the marriage on the witness stand. The fact that a woman who had spent her career studying and writing about criminals, who was herself a former police officer, who was intelligent and experienced and paying attention, sat beside him for months and felt nothing but warmth. He was very good at what he did, all of it,